Hello everyone, welcome to this first episode of Finding the Bible. This is going to stand as an instead. I was trying to do a live interaction of this using the documents that the OBRY project has created to try to use as better tools than the tools that are currently available, whatever Bible softwares or lexicons, dictionaries, concordances are available. These tools are a stand-in, hopefully, to help the reader, the student who wants to find out more about the language. The tools right now are published as they currently exist at the OBRY project website. So you can open all of those in a new tab on your browser, and you can use the PDFs in the same way that I'm using these OSK, so I'm doing all of this in LibreOffice. You can use them the same way. And the way that this is going to work is I'm mostly going to be using the OSK here, as well as my exhaustive OBRY biglyph roots table, which most of the time I'll probably just refer to it as the roots table. And it is, well, like the title suggests, it's pretty exhaustive. I've gone over it many times to try to make sure that I haven't left out any entries that would be helpful to us. And I will explain it as I go. There's only a few variations that you might see within it as I go, and I'll explain why those are there. I've tried to make the explanation of these things very clear in the document itself at the beginning, but it will help if you watch this, and as we go along I'll explain what I'm doing, because the roots table, like the OSK, which stands for OBRY Strong's KJV, it's an interlinear, the other document we're using, they are both works in progress. So I have published these works in progress to help you, and yet no, they're not perfect. If you find anything, like for instance a translation of verses that are missing in the OSK as you look through this, if you would, send me a message or an email or something, and I'll make sure that that's repaired, and then the new one published soon. I'm also using what I typically use, and I don't know how well this can be seen, so I'm just going to have to tell you, because of the way I have the window set up on my screen. I'm using Blue Letter Bible, and mostly I use that for just a broad search of the English, like a specific Strong's term in English. By the way, the Blue Letter Bible and the Strong's apps in eSword, which is the software I usually use for a lot of things, they don't agree. They don't always agree. Sometimes the Blue Letter Bible will tell you that a certain word has many entries, maybe hundreds or more, whereas you'll check it in eSword and it will say something different, and it might load those entries into another Strong's entry, which kind of red flaggy right there, and it should also show you the overlap of these entries and how they are fooling around with words' meanings by separating the same word into different entries and applying different meanings to it. So anyways, I will use the Blue Letter Bible. Sometimes I will use the online etymological dictionary. If we're trying to find the what I call them as PMC's, possible modern cognates of a given word in OBRY, I'll sometimes use the online etymological dictionary. I will sometimes use the free dictionary by Farlex. I will sometimes use the it's basically called wordtype.org, and you can put in a word and it will tell you what kind of word that is and how it's used. Now, all of these are important because if we use all of these, and once in a while I might bring up another tool or two. There's one or two, well, there's a few sites that actually, if you put a sentence into them, they will actually define what parts of speech certain words are. So we can use tools like that to compare, because every time we get to a verse, which should be one or more complete thoughts, we want to sometimes make sure that we can establish things like subject and predicate because that's so important in establishing whether or not a complete and coherent thought has been expressed. So these are just the basic tools that we'll be using as we go. So essentially what we're going to do, we'll begin in Genesis 1:1, and as we proceed, this whole series is meant to act as a way of reverse engineering the Masorah and its graphemes, like its Nikudot, the dots and dashes and all, that have had such a great bearing on the way that we understand these words, and also the end translations, but most specifically the English translations, because even though I'm not any sort of expert multilinguist, I've had to compare oftentimes the end language translations, a lot of times German, sometimes Slavic, and that would usually, more often than not, in fact, maybe always, coming from the Septuagint, which sometimes we'll compare. We'll compare the Septuagint, the Koine Greek words when we need to. But anyways, I would say that any end language I've seen, I would honestly think it would be at least very easy to argue that many of those could have actually come from an English translation, like those other end languages. And what I'm saying is that, and hey, you know what, maybe most of the traditions we get it claim that English was one of the early language types that these were translated into anyways, and I think that works out really great for the establishment, because I think that was their intention from the start, was English. I just don't think it was as long ago as, you know, Tyndale and Wycliffe and that whole narrative. But the whole point is going to be essentially attempting to reverse engineer the whole thing to see if we can see through what the Masorah has done, see if we can determine to the best of our abilities what these individual glyphs mean and what combinations of them mean mostly by way of comparison. We will compare words within the text, and we will compare words within their families, and we'll do that by way of the roots table. And this is one of the biggest reasons to have the roots table. So, what's going to happen with this, since we're reverse engineering, or we're attempting to, a lot of time will probably be spent in the earlier parts of the Old Testament. And if we spend an adequate amount of time in the early part, this should help kind of in a sort of a descending snowball effect, where it just makes everything faster and faster as we go, to determine what words probably are, or their combinations of. And this is going to be pretty exhaustive, because we want to look at the whole words, we want to take a look at them in context, we want to also consider their affixed glyphs, so prefixes and suffixes, and things like that. And I'm going to do my best to try not to make it all too technical, so that really anyone could watch this or listen to it and understand the way that this is proceeding forward in as logical a way as we possibly can, to determine what we can about the text and what the text is really saying. So the last thing I'm going to say that I'm going to do as part of this study is, as we determine each word, what might be a better translation for each word, I'm actually going to be creating a different form of these two documents that I have right now. Right now on screen is the OSK. It's just the WLC, so it's from the Westminster Leningrad Codex. WLC OSK New. That's the document here. That's the one I have published at the website. And same thing, this is simply the exhaustive OBRY biglyph roots table. As we go, part of this study, we'll determine what words seem best for any given word that we come across. When we do that, I'm going to make every entry of that word in that document the same. So instead of us having to look at a Strong's entry, like, so let me see, Oni, afflict, trouble, that's pretty close. And then Oni again, same word, poor, humble, lowly, and we'll get to that too. Not just within one Strong's code will I make all the words the same, but we're going to try to compare the other words that are the exact same word to what we've already found out about, that existing word. So instead of having to deal with all of these different, like Onan could be, what, is it observed? Or is it soothsayers, enchanters, observers? Well, we'll try to make sure that every occurrence of any word is exactly the same, plus if it has affixes on it, like prefixes or suffixes, we're going to have to address that as we go too. And what I'll have is I'll have these new documents as we go, and I will publish them as often as I can as the working documents that are part of this series. So we'll dive right in, and we'll start with Genesis 1:1. Now, the way that the OBRY would read without the Mizora is Bereshit bara Alaim at Shemaim u at Aretz. And the way the English tends to go in virtually every kind of Bible translation, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Simple enough. And I would think most people that even have a rudimentary grasp of Hebrew or now OBRY would look at that and probably think, that seems pretty reasonable. Such a short and simple verse, but that's one thing we're looking to find out. Is it reasonable? We don't want to just assume that it is. So the way it works is the Bereshit is said to be made up of two words. One word is, well, not two words, but a word with affixes. The root is supposed to be Rash. This R-A-Sha, with a prefix, the B, which is typically translated as either in, with, by, near. And the YT suffix is part of one of the entries. So you'll find the word Rashit with the YT on it as its own entry. Now, the general consensus is that the YT acts as a diminutive, which is interesting that we should see the form of this word Rash with this YT if it's a diminutive in this, because instantly when I look at this whole word Bereshit, I don't see in the beginning. At best, if we want to believe the Mizora and we want to be consistent, what I see at best is in a beginning. A beginning. It's not Rashit. You would have to have that E as the definite article as per their rules. There's no Rashit, it's just Bereshit. So already we have a problem, because the beginning and a beginning are vastly, vastly different concepts. So problem number one. And then we go on bara, which is translated as created. We're going to see some issues with that as well. And then we see this word alaim, which is translated mostly as God, but not always. So we can't just take that at face value either. At. Now, the consensus with at, it's not always non-translated, but many times it is. You'll find, if you check the Strongs, that at as H853 is defined as basically the sign of the definite direct object. So as we see in the Blue Letter Bible's definition of Strong's H853, sign of the definite direct object not translated in English, but generally preceding and indicating the accusative. So the accusative is typically going to be the object that they say is being acted on by the verb, right? So if we go back here, the verb, of course, they're saying is bara, and the objects here are the Shamayim, which is translated the heaven, and Aretz, the earth, U'at, so you have U'at again. You don't just have bara aliyim at Shamayim, Eretz, but you have at every time. Now this doesn't stay consistent. I will let you know right now, and we'll see this as we go. Sometimes when there appears to be, in our current understanding, sometimes when there appears to be multiple objects as accusatives of a particular verb, sometimes you'll have the at each time, and sometimes you don't. So that's why we always have to pay attention to even the smallest thing, like this at. I will tell you that I'm not convinced whatsoever that at shouldn't be translated. And we're going to address that as well as we go. So then we have this word shamaim. Now, I think it's always important when we do see this definite article, and this word certainly does look like a noun. Shamaim. I think it's always important that something has or doesn't have the definite article on it, and we can't ever just give it a pass if it doesn't have the direct article and the translation does, or vice versa. So again, we have the u'at, and then we have aretz. And aretz in this case is translated the earth. But what we'll see is that they oftentimes like to vary how this is translated. And we need to take a look at this too to see if overall it's better translated as earth or one of its other variations. So we'll just begin with our first term, Bereshit. The way it's translated is, they say that Reshit is basically the root Rosh, which it's its own entry because it has this YT at the end, as they say is a diminutive, and they're saying that it's presented with the B prefix on the front, and that's why it's translated as in. Though, real quick before we go forward, because we want to look at every aspect of this. So I know some have heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. I believe that the B prefix that we see in OBRY is as close to equivalent to the English term by, and you're going to see me compare endless amounts of words that we're going to see in OBRY to English specifically. And why do I go directly to the English instead of searching around anymore in Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, things Latin? Because you'll find a lot in Latin. Because many of those languages, the references, like the old references on those languages, Gaelic, Anglo-Saxon, German, they seem to me, a couple reasons. They seem to me, one, to in a sense be backward engineered in a very weird way, especially the older ones. Most of the languages spoken of today, if they're still spoken, they're nothing like those older ones. It's almost like those older references were in many ways just created to make it seem like there was this great diversity of languages and cultures and differences in certain languages that there wasn't at that time. The other reason is because consistently I find these words have English equivalents. Now, not absolutely always, but more often than not, and therefore I don't have to spend the kinds of insane amounts of time that I was spending in all of those other reference works. So the interesting thing about just the word by, it did appear in Webster's 1864 in comparison with the Hebrew prefix bet. That's the letter we're looking at, is B. Funny thing is, like, no matter what they want to call it as a part of speech, adverb, noun, adjective, preposition, interjection, by always works pretty much the same way. Like, for instance, when they say it can be an adverb, and they say along a path which runs by the speaker. What they used it literally in the definition, by the speaker. So they give an example. I watched as it passed by. It's being used in the same way that it would be to anything else. It's being used as a preposition. They call it an adverb. It's a preposition. It means near to the person describing it. Now they say by used as a noun, and they say a pass. And literally, I stared at this for probably 10 minutes trying to figure out what exactly do they mean. Don't know. We'll let that go for just a second. By used as an adjective. So out of the way subsidiaries. So maybe like a byword, bygone era. Still functioning in a very similar way. By used as a preposition. This one is the obvious, right? The mailbox is by the bus stop. Be back by 10 o'clock. So that's like a time interval. The first one was near or next to, the super obvious one. Through the action or presence of. The matter was decided by the chairman. Well, is that the same thing as, like, if it's used prepositionally, like spatially, like in this case, if it truly is saying Bereshit in the beginning, is it saying kind of the same thing? Yes. I believe so. Like, by way of, the matter was decided by the chairman. It's moving everything to a close relationship to the subject at hand. Or let's just say the word that it's attached to. Even though now they're separate words in English, I believe it's always working in the same way. And it's a little bit tough because, as for right now, it might be difficult for us to see all of the equivalents when we try to do a mechanical translation from OBRY. Like, a good example was in the law. There's a few examples where Yahweh says the things he did. So he's talking about the miracles and the great wonders he did. Be Mitzrim. So you got that be prefix with Mitzrim. And you would think, well, that definitely means in. Well, no, it doesn't mean in all the time. Sometimes it can certainly mean in, but we could be looking at it by way of, but we don't have to think of it always as the preposition. Just by making these words different and giving it a different equivalent, in, we automatically think of something very different than the way that this was supposed to function. We're going to have to think a little bit differently. Because there's also passages where it says, like, for instance, Isaac camped be Nachal. Well, there's not a chance. Nachal is river. It's translated as river. Hundreds of times it works pretty darn good as river. And there's no way that Isaac camped in the river. We'll see that. And the thing is, it's interesting how it functions when it's directly on a word that they're counting as either a 2-glyph or a 3-glyph word, which we'll see in the next word. But I just wanted to address that because I think that it's not productive for us to leave any rock uncovered. So we're supposed to believe that we're looking at a word that is a Strong's entry, Rashit, based on the root Rash with the prefix be on it. Now there's a couple of possibilities. One possibility is this word really what they're saying, be, and rush, and the YT suffix, or is this a compound word? because we should at least consider that. So the thing is, if it was a compound word, I'm going to give you an explanation which is going to make sense to anyone who joined that first live stream as to why I began with the word bera instead of the Bereshit. And you can see that this word bera is right here, bera. Let me explain this real quick and tell you why I'm not sure that this, what we see here, is a compound word. I'm going to explain to you what it could be if it was a compound word, and then why I don't think it could be, so you can make up your own mind on this. So the first part would have to be bera as one root. Now, bera we're going to get to. What it's typically translated as I can show you real quick, go to Ra. It's typically translated as create. We do have create being bara, being the next word. So this compound would have to be a combination of whatever bera really means, as well as sheet. And we can look at what we have in sheet. We mostly have something like set, put, or make. A couple of times attire or garment, and 7 times is thorn. Now, a few of these, when you see like chate, like H8354 or 56, drink or foundation, purpose. I mean, maybe it's also translated the chate as buttocks. I mean, if you want to imagine that there's a compound word that means create buttocks, I suppose that's up to you. I think you might have a hard time selling that one. But what I'm saying is I don't think that we're looking at a compound word because it doesn't appear that we actually would have what we really need for this phrase to make a lot of sense to us. And what I believe what we need for this phrase to make sense to us is I think we do need this be or by prefix. I think it might be, because I've examined this in a lot of different ways, it might be absolutely necessary for this first clause or phrase to make sense. So now that we've talked a little bit about the prefix and the potential for the prefix meaning and its use, I do want to talk about the suffix, even though I know it is listed as Strong's H7225 as Rashit. We're still looking, we have to look beyond the words they give us. When they say, well, this is a word, and they might or might not say it's based on this root with this, and in what they'll tell us is that that's a diminutive suffix, that YT. Oh, I am also going to use the Wikipedia on prefixes in Hebrew and the Wikipedia on suffixes in Hebrew. These are not complete. There's other books that'll give us some decent information as far as the establishment goes. One of them is an introduction to Hebrew grammar by Frederick Nolan. I use that sometimes to get a sense of, because it was published quite a long time ago. This one was said to have been published, I think, in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, so sketchy. It gives us a view into what the rules of Hebrew grammar were then. So I will use some texts like this, and there's a few other texts I might actually peruse if I'm not really finding the answers there. But I just want to bring to your attention that a generally agreed upon term in Hebrew grammar for the YT at the end, or Yad Tav, I'm not going to always be quoting these as their Hebrew equivalents, Yad and Tav. Well, it's YT. Most of the time you can look and figure it out, or pay attention, and you'll get the feel for it, because OBRY glyphs or characters are so like unto, so near unto English letters that it will take very little time for you to grab on. There's only a few variations, and most of those are compound sounds, like the TH. There's a TH letter that or glyph that they call the tet. but it's very similar to like the theta, or what they might call the Saxon T, TH sound. There's the tsa, which is TS, which oftentimes is transliterated into just S, or sometimes Z, depending on the environment that it's in, the word that it's in. There's also sha, that looks very much like a W. By the way, the tsa looks a bit like an X, sort of. But yeah, most of the other letters are pretty much English equivalents. Or whatever language you speak, they're going to be pretty close, unless you speak Chinese. Okay, most Western alphabets. Anyways, so they'll say that this YT, eat, is, again, diminutive suffix. Sometimes, I love how many sometimes and maybe and all those that you see in Hebrew grammar. But they only equate this to nouns. So they give like sak, sakit, or kaf, spoon, kapit, okay? But we see it on verbs all the time. So what would be a good idea is just to check a few words, nouns, verbs, maybe what I typically call descriptives, which could be adjectives, adverbs, to see how this YT tends to be used. Because what'll happen is, if you can check something in enough contexts, even though they may have changed the wording and the context of that verse, what will start emerging is like the dominant characteristic or use of a word or a suffix or a phrase. So that's what I tend to do. So what I'll do is I'll go to my search down here and I'll punch in the Y, and not T, but I, because this last hard T sound, I put in my keyboard as Y when I was assigning letters on the keyboard. Not Y, I. So the TH sounding glyph that looks like a circle with an X in it, that is the T on the keyboard. This is the I on the keyboard. So I'll punch in Y, I, and then I'll leave a space, because then my program, including whatever's going to read your PDF, they'll see that you put a space in there, and you can find it as a suffix. You don't want to find it in the middle or the beginning of the word, okay? First word that we come to in a search is this heat, and it's translated typically as beast or living things. I don't want to go too much into the long grass, but a lot of times this H glyph seems to tend to indicate a repetition, like a chain, or if you look at it, you've got just lines over and over and over. And it looks a lot like our modern H too. With that YT at the end, if that meant something, well, complete. Think about the word complete. That actually probably has this suffix in it. To compile is the verb of doing, but to complete is the finish, the consummation of compiling, complete. And we might see it in words like replete, or think of a lot of words that have not ET, because that's probably a modern suffix based on UT from OBRY. And not ITE, because that's probably mostly based on the Y suffix of OBRY, like a Canoni, Canaanite, but ETE, complete, replete. You might be able to think of some other words that have that ETE ending and think of how that works. I think you might even find it in words like eternity, even though you have the Y at the very end. A turn or a term, it. So the idea of complete, perfection, always, eat, of, with the Y at the end, eternity. Now, I'm not standing behind that definition of eternity. I'm saying that's a very strong possibility that it actually contains this suffix. But let's look at more suffix in the Old Testament. because heat is a tough one, right? Oh, and I missed one. I'm sorry. Like, for instance, oshit. So, the osh is translated very typically pretty darn well as do or make most of the time. Osh. Now, I don't know what its possible modern cognate might be, but it works pretty well for do or make. You put the YT on it, and we see it's a past tense. Oshit. Has done. I forgot, I started the search a little bit forward. We can see it again in Genesis 3:13. Oshit, thou hast done. It's done. It's complete. They're not doing it. They're not gonna do it. They done did it. It's complete. Now, you'll see something that might throw you off if you look at Genesis 3:15. U ayibe ashit, which they say, I will put enmity between. However, this A, which stands for a personal I, like I will, the A at the front of a verb, they say it's future, but it works way too many times in context with present tense or past tense. It just works as I a lot in various different tenses. So this could very easily be I have put, I did put. Then like Genesis 6:12, it appears in shechit, had corrupted, done. It's completed. It's sort of like full. If we look at the T being at the end, so the T resembles very much a mark. In a sense like a crosshairs, if you think of the accuracy of aiming, a mark of accuracy. I know I still have the OBRY T's leaning a little bit. I don't know if you want to think of something like X marks the spot, but it's almost the same idea in exactitude. So with the Y before it, is that indicating an active exactness? Or it is done always is in the act of doing, since the Y so oftentimes can indicate before a word. Remember, that Y is not at the end of the word. The T is at the end of the word. Often at the beginning of the word, that Y represents action. It represents current action. So we're getting this sense of something that is complete. And we could keep going with this because there are tons and tons and tons of words in the Bible that end with the suffix YT. Now, of course, we're not necessarily, I don't think, because we don't have any indication that we're looking at a verb here. We seem to be looking at a noun or a descriptive. So what I would suggest is that Rashit means something that is Rash, and we're going to try to determine what that Rash really means. And that YT, instead of being diminutive, I think is going to act a little bit more as being something of more of an accuracy. And I'll try to think of a better word than just accuracy, because just the T at the end could mean accuracy or complete. So before we go too far on the YT as a suffix, we really need to look at the root, and then we can try to put this together. So in order to look at the root, Rosh, we really need to look at Rosh's root, Ash. Now, why when I say Ash is the root of Rosh, instead of saying maybe Ra, the first two glyphs are the root of Ash? Well, like everything else that I've had to do over the years, what I've found is that the root is most of the time at the end, and that the accent is at the beginning when we're looking at a biglyph or a triglyph root. Let me give you a couple examples of what I mean so you know I'm on the right track, considering Ash the root of Rosh. So we got BA, for instance. Now this is really common. Ba, this root occurs, well, I've got it listed as about 25 to 2600 times. And it always, and I mean always, except for about 20 or 30 times, which I demonstrate in my book, The Bible versus the Middle East, really well. It does absolutely mean to come to the subject or object. It means to come near, to come into, by, okay? Now, if you look at it and you think, well, we just established that that be kind of, means that, right? Well, yeah, but the thing is, the A tends to always be referring to the subject at hand. So that would actually be the stronger glyph, and the B would be acting as the accent in that simple root. So come to what? Come towards the subject. Come to, not away from, like a word more like butts. We could do it. We could see it again in something like H3824, labab, which is typically translated as heart, or sometimes even as middle, not even a person like their heart. The insides, the middle, okay? So actually the root of that is bab, B and B, and the first B accentuates the second B. Yes, the second B would still be something to the degree of in, with, by, near, but the first one is accenting that. So we're talking about something at the core. If your heart aches, it is your core, your center, your interior that aches. To bab, labab, the heart, the center, the core. And we can see it in roots, for instance, like ben, which is typically translated as son, but is probably way more accurate as children, because we see words like benut clearly being somebody's daughters that are being spoken of. And we also see ben in words that are translated, for instance, a building or a thing made. All right, so we have the N, which I believe tends to demonstrate a flowing, as we can see, and it's used so often in words that have to do with streams, river, like Nahal. It's used in Ner, Nazal. But in here, if it's a flowing forth, the N indicates that. And then the B is accenting that. By, in, with, flowing forth, it would explain why it's used as your children, coming forth from two people. Or also why it's used like benut, as in creations, buildings, things made. People created them. So you get the point of how that typically, that last glyph, unless it's a weaker glyph like the E, or it's meant to signal something at the end, which we'll get to when we approach that, the accent tends to always be towards the end. And I could give you a lot of examples of this, but we'll do that as we go forward. Let's just go back to Rosh and start determining the actual meaning of Rosh. So if Rosh is our word, and its dominant root is Ash, what do we have for Ash? Well, we do have Ash in this family here of the Ash section. And what we see for Ash is it's translated about 380 times as fire. Now, is it fire? Maybe, maybe not. And here's what I mean. A lot of times when you go to sections that contain either Ash as 784, or let's see, or Asha, offering, they have to include by fire in here. It's not always clear, and it's also used as a woman when, like for instance, when Yahweh gives Adam his woman, Asha. Ash, is it fire? If it is, it could be, maybe. But I'm thinking more like offering or to offer up. And I don't mean in the sense of slaughter, killing, necessarily. Let's just make that very clear. To offer up something does not necessarily mean to slaughter or kill it. We've just gotten that stuck in our heads because of the way translations insert words. But if this is the case, well, let's look at the very last glyph. Let's break it right down to its very minute parts. The last glyph in that is what? It's the sh. The sh, or they call it the shin, it looks like a W. Looks very much like a W. So I was wrong about this glyph for a long time because of how many words are dubiously translated in the sense of like you could kind of see it as maybe something downward. But the more I look at it, like the more I look at the simple words that it's contained in, I think what it's demonstrating to us is an uplifting. In fact, you could say that that looks like something lifting. You look at the two arms of it, and maybe that's a head in the middle, or something. It very much looks like a lifting. Not a pressing down, which I kind of thought it was maybe 2 points pressing down. But the more we look at words that contain this sha as the root glyph, I think the more we'll agree that it has to do with uplift. Now, if it's used in offering, you have that. If it really does mean fire, this ash, well, the one thing that happens when you burn is that that hot air and everything else goes upward. Not downward. Goes upward. It's also used in, for instance, bash, B-A-sha, to stink or a stench. And I'm sorry to make it so cartoony, but you know, like when you see animations where they're trying to show you that something stinks, you have those wavy lines that are what? That are coming up, that are wafting up from something. A stench or a stink. We have some very small odds and ends, which could be, could not be. And, well, when you see something only 1 or 2 times, it's a little hard to determine. But I would say just from those couple of roots, we're justified by looking at something that has to do with being upright. Okay? And there's one other thing about this, just to add to it. We also should consider some English terms. Terms like, well, rash, to act hastily, to be high-strung, or even a rash like a rising and redness on the skin. But more than that, if instead of punching in R-A-S-H to something like Online Etymological Dictionary, we try some variations and we end up at R-A-C-H, because so oftentimes the gods of language will use CH for an SH sound, rush, right? So we'll try CH, and what do we get? We get a whole lot of things having to do with the spine. We see rachitic, which they say to have rickets, which has to do with the spine. A bone disease and inflammation of the spine. And they say it's from rachis, spine or back, but we also see like rachio, a word-forming element meaning spinal, pertaining to the vertebrae, the spine. So if you see spine, you're going to essentially see this R-A-C-H, rush, upright, spine. The spine is straight and upright. Well, it's not all that straight if you look at it from the side. Upright. Rash, maybe high-strung. Just keep some of those words in mind. Because when we go back to this whole table, we have a lot of different variations of rush. I mean, they have marashe, which is principality. Remember, they're saying rashit. Keep this in mind before we go searching for rashit. It's mostly translated as beginning or first, or sometimes first fruits. We'll see that. But we want to know for sure that that bereshit means in with by beginning. We want to be absolutely sure. We don't want to just assume. We don't want to just say, well, it makes sense, because other words could be in there which could not only make sense, but give us more insight to what's being said and everything being said after. This is why we would spend so much time on one word, because it's the first word in the Bible, and I would argue that it is of the utmost importance that we get that word right. It appears 8 times in Machtemes as a bolster or pillow. Maybe 8 times. Yeah, maybe. Now, it appears in just Rosh 72:18, head, top, sometimes chief, beginning, even principality. It's interesting. Now, anatomically, it seems to be referring to head anatomically. If someone is being described, and like something was done to a part of their anatomy, and the word Rosh is used, it does seem to be indicating their top or their head. Now, it occurs 12 times and translated as gall or poison, which is really interesting. Don't know what that means, just telling you what it appears as 12 times as Rosh. We also have 1 time Rashet with that feminine E ending as beginnings 1 time. We have it 1 time being translated same way, Rashet, as headstone. We do have it, it says 183 times as Rashun, first or former. And then we have it 1 time, Rashani, as first. Then there's our word, 53 times as beginning or first. And then we go back again to 7226, Rosh, what? Bolster or pillow. And I would say we're getting some very mixed messages here. And here's why. Because a head, whether we're talking about the physical anatomical body part, the head, or like the head of a blister pimple, like, or if we're talking about, for instance, the chief, or like it's sometimes translated as the top, or principality. That is something that is really more of an importance thing. Like something regarded as the main thing. Like in a body, I would argue that someone's head is the chief component of their body. Yes, it's at the top, unless you're hanging by your feet. Or unless you're laying down. It's not at the top. So let's not just think of top, but let's think of something more like importance. Importance. Because someone's head, which it's translated as the head anatomically a whole lot. It's at the top of your body if you're standing or sitting up, but if you're laying down, it's not. But it's still the Rosh, so it still must be the most important thing, the chief thing. I hesitate to use the word height, but you see where I'm going with that. I don't necessarily mean height as an elevation. We're talking about importance. Something important. Important. Now, the thing is, that idea, the chief or most important item in a body or on a thing or whatever, is not equivalent to first. It is not equivalent to first. Maybe first if we're qualifying it as an importance, then okay. But here they're qualifying it chronologically, like in time. And if you don't see what the issue is that I have, I'll explain. The issue that I have is, if we're looking at a timeline and something starts, let's say we're looking at a foot race, and the foot race starts at a point, and it's real possible, especially if it's a short race, there will be a middle point which might be considered more of the body or subject of interest, more than the start. And then we have the finish. If we build something, we would have the foundation of the thing. Then we would have the body, and then we would have at the top probably the roof, the finish, the completeness, and the one thing is not necessarily the other. If we start at a point, it's the beginning, so it's like the foundation. To me, in my mind, as I think about this, I don't think of, and I know in Judaism, in Jewish terms, which I posit are inorganic, they use a term Rosh Hashanah as the head of the year, right? Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. It is interesting that Rosh Hashanah happens 6 months after the actual first of the year. The actual first of the year is back in the spring, right before Passover. Rosh Hashanah is 6 months later, not the first of the year. Keep that in mind too. So we're looking at terms that are non-equivalent. We can't just think that if Rosh is something very similar to head, chief, principal, like maybe even zenith or something, we can't equate that necessarily with first. But we do have to check a few words, like for instance, it occurs as this Rishun a bunch of times, and they want to translate it most of the time as first or former. So one thing we want to see is, for instance, if this big word Rishun is in big, like how many times it occurs, if that really probably is first and or former, mostly first, if that actually works, or if this other idea of like chief importance, height of, zenith of a thing, something like that, would actually fit better than first. But let's look at a few occurrences at least, because we need to get some insight on H7223 Rashun because it occurs so many times. We're not going to look at anywhere near all of its occurrences, but we're going to look at some. Its very first occurrence is in Genesis 8:13, and in English, it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark. Now here's the thing about that. When we look at it in its source language, it starts out with iei, so basically something that is or was to be. Achat. Now the thing is, achat, there's your first. They're saying that's your first right there. Achat. And shash, 6. Ma'ut, 100. Shaneh. They say that's year. Rashun. Now they're back to saying Rashun is in the first. Ahad, first. So wait a minute. Why not ahad? Why does it have to be... this word immediately following it is the first. You've got Rashun, which they're saying is the first, immediately followed by another word that they say is the first. Ahad is usually one, and now Rashun. So in the first one to Chadash, the month. So I get immediately suspicious when two words that essentially have to be synonyms are occurring in the same verse to describe the same thing. I get a little bit suspicious. We're not going to look at occurrences of Rashneh. The reason is because that's probably Ashan, a completely different word, completely different root. And they mix those things all the time. We're looking for Rashun. So they would say like Genesis 25:25, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment. So they're describing the birth of Esau and Jacob. And the actual wording is u'itza, which is like to come out, the Rashun. So they're saying, oh, that's the first. And then it says, Admuni red kalu ka adrat. Okay, so if we regard Rashun as the first, and what they mean by that is the first baby, what we have to do then is we have to believe the translation as it stands, as in the entire baby came out all red and hairy. I can't even imagine Rebecca giving birth to a werewolf. If the first is referring to the entire baby, then we have to believe that the entire baby came out red and hairy. As opposed to, if we look at this and it's saying essentially not the first, but either the principal, which is not the first, or even better yet, the head. The head. And if they're saying the head came out the head, that's the way babies are born, I hear. In fact, I saw 2 of them born just that way. And if it is head, then we can understand that it's coming out all hairy, like a garment. Sure. And actually what they could be describing is that his head was so hairy, because not a lot. Okay, so if you've seen enough newborn babies, some of those babies, their hair is real light and it's real sparse on their head. But there are some babies that come out, their head, like I had a friend, his daughter was born almost right at the same time as my daughter, right? And her head was red and like the thickest red hair. It was amazing. So if you want to consider that Rashun as being the first, then you have to think it's the whole baby. So you have to think that Esau was literally hairy all over as a baby. I've never even heard of such a thing. It sounds like a nightmare. And we can see this over and over again. Genesis 32:17, when it said he commanded the foremost, saying, when Esau is my brother, when he meets you and asks you, saying, who are you, and where do you go, and where are these before thee? Is he saying the very first person that would be the first person to get to Esau? Maybe. Or is he saying to the chief, the head, as in the chief or the head of his servants that he sent out with a few different bands of people managing different flocks of different animals that he sent out to Esau to tell him what to tell Esau? Would you think he would tell the chief, or would he tell the first person? Would he put kind of a dumb person at the front of the line as in the first, or is he talking to his chief, the person that he put in charge? So the whole point to all of this is to say that I know that sometimes it seems like an accurate synonym to equate first with like most important, or you know what, something like that. But the thing is, that's not what they're trying to relay to us in Reshit. They're trying to relay to us in Reshit a chronological relationship. And that might not, stay with me, that might not be the case. We might be looking at something that is telling us not at first, chronologically, but something different. Like as instead of first, something of importance. Instead of relaying to us the first, because here's the thing. If we have someone or someones, don't read into that I'm saying that. Just don't. But if we have a party, someone that is making something, and it's the first book beginning a record, it's not the first thing to happen. It's not the first thing to happen. Okay, so whatever it's telling us, Is it telling us the first thing to happen to this creation? It's possible. But the last thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the occurrences of Reshit and Bereshit. We're going to do a search on Reshit and see if that bears out that it looks like first chronologically as opposed to preeminent, as in qualitatively. And there's a difference. The first occurrence we get of Reshit, besides in Genesis 1:1, is Genesis 10:10. And it's supposedly describing, city's location, something like that, of this Nimrod. And it says, in the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh and Shinar. So it says, Ute'i Reshit Mamelakut or Mamelakatu. So basically, more like and was Reshit. So there's no definite article, just Reshit. So I guess we could say beginning, first fruit, because remember, it's also translated as first fruit. We could say that's his kingdom, and then it's listing these places. It's interesting that 4 places are regarded as the beginning of his kingdom, but I mean, sure, maybe it is. Maybe it is, and maybe it's saying something like the principle of it, like the greatest part, that sort of thing of his kingdom, which would work, conceptually would work just fine. Now the next one's noteworthy because it's Genesis 49:3. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. Well, it says Reuben, which is, we know what that is. And it says Bakuri. Now this word, the Y at the end is possessive, but this Bakur, it's used plenty of times as firstborn. The firstborn of anything, Bakur. It's interesting that we'd also have Reshit, which is supposed to be first, beginning, first fruits. Auni, my strength. It seems a little strange. Well, because it doesn't say Uyitar, like and the excellency. It's just Yitar, which would probably be Auni, my strength, Yitar, excellency, Urashit, the greatest part of my strength, excellency, Shat, maybe dignity. Just saying, it's interesting that those two, anytime I see two terms that are supposed to be synonyms, like we saw with Rishun and Ahad, it just sticks out. So we'll move on. Where it starts to get tricky is Exodus 23:19. In English it says, the first of the first fruits of thy land thou shalt bring into the house of Yahweh. The problem is, in the source language, it actually says Reshit Bakuri Adam Tak. Now, I won't get into if Adam Tak is the land or not, but it's pretty weird. It's like way weirder than the last verse to have Reshit Bakuri. Now, most often, Bakuri is going to indicate the first, as in first fruits or firstborn. It's even Bakuri is even translated as first fruits here. So, to call something Reshit, the first of the first fruits, or the first of the first, is a little weird. Now, to say the greater part, or the best, or the chief, as in qualitatively, that might be a lot more sensible. And we have the same exact thing in Exodus 34:26. Rashit Bakuri. So again, we have to be looking at the first of the first. Here's one that doesn't have to do with these two synonymous terms necessarily, but it's just something for us to think about. It's Leviticus 2:12. As for the oblation of the first fruits, and here Rashit is translated as first fruits. Ye shall offer them unto Yahweh, but they shall not be burnt on an altar for a sweet savor. So here's the part where we need to consider the concept. Rashit is translated a number of times as first fruits, as in like, you should offer these, you offer your first fruits. That's when it's translated first fruits like that. The thing is, anybody who works in, you don't have to work in farming. You can have grown a garden. You can have raised animals for meat or whatever purposes. Wool, other things, leather. And typically the leather is going to come from animals you're using for other things. But the point is, your first things, they're not the best things. When I grow a garden, the first fruits of the garden are not the best. It's what comes when everything is rolling along, when everything's starting to bring forth its fruit. I get the best of the fruits during that time. So I'm just saying, if it would be strange to say to bring the first, and I think it would be more natural to say bring the best. I think it would just be more natural. Bring the better things. And we'll see the exact same thing repeated in Leviticus 23:10. Again, is the first the best thing? The first of your harvest? The first of your harvest, as opposed to the better part of your harvest. I mean, after that, we got Numbers 15:20. Rashit Orst Kam. It's supposed to be like, of the first of your dough. The way they word it, they completely change the syntax. You shall offer up a cake of the first of your dough. Well, it doesn't matter how they change the syntax. As someone who's done a lot of baking, the first part of your dough isn't even the best part. The first part of your dough is oftentimes meh, especially if we're talking about what? We're talking about working with a starter or something. It just doesn't make as much sense at all. The interesting thing about Numbers 18:12 is the language that's being used, I think, is pointing us in the direction where I think we should be with Rashit. Because it says kol halab, so all, really the fats of yitze'er, and they're saying that's oil, and kol halab, all the fats of tirush, they're saying is wine, udagan, and they're saying that's wheat. And then they say, Rashitem asher yitanu. So we're supposed to believe that's first fruits, and the M at the end, I would say, is referring to them, everything that it's just named, not a plural. Rashitem asher yitanu. So, the best of them which you give, and then la Yahweh, to Yahweh. And the reason I say that is because it's preceded by kol halab, all of the fat, the fat, not first, the fats of. You could, sometimes halab is translated as fat, sometimes as milk, but we're definitely talking about the richness of a thing. Okay? So, to contrast that with Rashitem and believe that that's first fruits is a little weird, because conceptually, applying something like the best of, the chiefest of things, does make a lot more sense. So even more interesting is Numbers 24:20. The English says, and when he looked on Amalek, he took up his parable, and he said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall be that he perish forever. Now, this is Balaam, and he's having, I suppose, these visions, right? And he is essentially kind of giving out these prophecies about different nations and peoples at this time. The wording is what's very interesting when he gets past, it says, Uyira, he looked at. See, this is the funny thing about at, that word at that we went over, that's supposed to be just the sign of the definite direct object. When you just read it plainly, Uyira, and looked at, Omlak, Oyisha, and he took up Mashalu, and they would say his parable, Iyamr, and said, Rashit Guyim Omlak. That's important. That's exactly how it's written in there. Rashit Goyim Omlak. So first off, there's no definite article. There's no Rashit. It's just Rashit, and then Goyim. So Goyim, we'll go with nations for now. It's fine. Rashit Goyim Omlak. Now it's funny too because they're kind of stuck. What are they going to say? They're either going to say Rashit is beginning, or first fruits, or in this case, first. And there's no was, but was the first of the nations, Omlak. So that's what Rashit Goyim Omlak, it's saying something about Omlak. Is it saying Omlak is the first Rashit, like as in chronologically? Well, it can't be, because Omlak was not the first nation chronologically. In fact, Omlak was a grandson of Oshu, or Esau, so there's not a chance. Omlak was definitely not chronologically the first, but Omlak was quite a nation at the time. Okay, so to say something like Rashit, the best of, the highest quality, or preeminent, or like chief, Goyim, nations, Omlak. That makes sense. Definitely not the first chronologically. Absolutely not. Now, they included the entry from Deuteronomy 11:12, which isn't even Rashit. It's Merishit. So it's M-R-Sh-Y-T. Merishit. It doesn't have the ah. It doesn't have the ah, so it doesn't complete that biglyph root ash. So Rish by itself, without that A, is typically translated as things like poverty or lowness, things like that, which could absolutely fit in here contextually as such, and does not have to be the first of the year. It could be from the how should I say, from the lull of the year to the end of the year, if all of the other surrounding words are translated appropriately. But it's definitely not Rashit, it's Rishit. Different word. I know you don't have to take this next one very seriously, but Deuteronomy 18:4, it says Rashit it's about giving, and this has everything to do with the government, what the Levites would take in, what they were to essentially have for themselves, sort, give out. This is very much about the government and the resources of the land and how they would be used. I think that is, yes, that is my opinion, but you can see a lot of that in the language. But anyways, it's saying here in English, the first fruit also of thy corn and of thy wine and thy oil, and the first of thy sheep. It's same word, Rashit. I don't know why they didn't say the first fruit of the fleece of thy sheep shall you give him. Because I suppose if you're giving the first of the fleece of the sheep, that would be very little. since you want to wait until they're fully grown and puffed out really good, and then you shear the sheep. Now, the next few verses were just repetitions of what we've been seeing about bringing and offerings, and we've seen these things, and there's no need to keep going over them. We get to Deuteronomy 33, 20, and 21. I think this is a good example of how the verses break a thought, because I believe we're looking at Moses blessing the various tribes, and he gets to Gad, and in Deuteronomy 33:20 in the English it says, "And of Gad he said, Blessed be he that enlargeth Gad. He dwelleth as a lion, and teareth the arm with the crown of the head. And he provided the first part for himself, because there in a portion of the lawgiver he was seated." Like, it's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. Which I think it's actually just continuing a thought, like, Utherip, if that's tear. Zeru-o, the arm, maybe the seed. Ap, be with. Ap could be anger. Quad, is that the crown of the head? I sure don't know. But then it continues, and Ira. Now it says he provided, but Ira is typically translated as saw, or I would say probably better yet, like acknowledged. Rashit, lu. So the lu is to him. Rashit. He saw first fruits to him. He saw first to him, because they're halquat for a portion. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to say he acknowledged the best to him. But you can decide. You can decide that that's first. Seems like it makes good sense that it's the best part to him. This is always when I consider, like, the rubber meets the road. So we get, like, Genesis and part of Exodus, we tend to get very practical passages. For Genesis and the first part of Exodus, and I don't want to say they're unpractical, but when we get into, like, passages of the law, they're really tough. I mean, they really are. And a lot of the terminology is so dubious. So when we can get past that and get to, like, here, 1 Samuel 2:29, we really get to start seeing these things in some really, I think, really helpful contexts. So the English says, "Wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice and at my offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel, my people." In that sentence, or that phrase, the chiefest of all things, that is Moreshit. And to maybe to hone this down a little better, he's saying la bari akam, to make yourselves fat. If we're going with baria as fatten, like they normally translate baria as fatten, okay? Fatten, and then marashit, kol manachat, the offerings, Yisrael, laomi, to my people. What he's saying is, speaking to Eli about his sons, who Eli was, no offense, Eli was like kind of like a fat slob. That's how he's described. And his two sons were just the worst. I mean, they were just the worst. And it said that they would, like, take the best of the offerings, and the language seems to say, like, they would take advantage of women, just for the purposes of sex, not that they would take many wives to have children or anything like that, which even that's excessive. Like, obviously the law has no problem with a man having multiple wives, but let's be realistic. If a man has a bunch of wives, that's excessive. It's like Solomon. Or, I mean, even, well, David didn't have that many sons. Solomon had like 300 wives, 700 concubines. Come on, man. Seriously, come on. But they would take advantage of the women, so you're just using them for sex, if the language does mean that that's what they were doing. And they were taking the best of the offerings people were bringing there. So if it's saying to barit kam, to make yourselves fat, including Eli, ma from rashit, would that be the first of the offerings, or do you make yourself fat with the finest of the offerings? I think that's very telling, above a lot of other verses we've seen. And we've got in 1 Samuel 15:21 the situation where Saul and Israel went and were to utterly destroy Amalek, and just like everything they had. Yahweh wanted them kaput and totally. But Saul and the people, because Saul disobeyed, the people disobeyed. In English it says, but the people took of the spoil sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have utterly been destroyed, to sacrifice unto Yahweh, the God in Gilgal. And here, the Rashit, how is it translated? The first fruits? First? No, the chief of those things. They took the best, the finest things. Obviously, if you have the spoils of war, you can't take, what, the first things? Well, how do you sort that out? They took the best things. They took the finest things. That's why they had to translate it the chief things. Another very telling use of it in Amos 6:1. The English says, woe to them that are in ease in Zion, and trust in the mountains of Samaria. So we're talking about Zion, Jerusalem, Shomron, Samaria. So we got Judah and Israel, which are named chief of the nations, to whom the house of Israel came. The thing is, Amos is speaking to Israel, and he's saying that Israel and Judah, in his time, this was before some really terrible things happened with Aram, and then with Ashur, Assyria, then Mitzrayim and Babel. He's saying they are the chief, they're called the chief, or the finest of Egoyim, the nations, the peoples, the whatever you want to call them, tribes, the finest of. You could say tribes too, those that are in Zion and Shomron. Not the first. Not the first. Absolutely not chronologically the first, but the finest, the best. And again in Amos 6:6, again we're talking about, we're talking about various nations here. I don't know that I have to really pin down which nation in context. Woe to them that are in ease in Zion and Shomron, the verse we just saw. Continuing on to 6:6, that drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the what? Chief ointments. Because what are they going to say? That anoint themselves with the best? And it's urashit shamanim, so the best. Usually shaman, they say, is fats or oil, maybe ointments. The first or the best. So if they're the people that are in Siyun and Shomron, they are the aristocracies. That's the ruling cities presiding over everything else, taxing them, taking all of the best of everything, like Yahweh said the kings would do to all the tribes, all the people. They're anointing themselves with the first or the best, because even the translators used the chief ointments. So this one's pretty good too. I mean, Hosea 9:10. The English says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time. All right, so the source language, we'll say, we'll start with Matzati, I found, Yisrael, Israel, Ke Bekure, so we've got that firstborn, the first to come forth. Bekur, Ke Bekure, as the first, not first ripe, but the first. Tane, so it's supposed to be like fig tree, so I guess in a fig tree, I suppose. Rashite Ra'iti, so in something I saw, maybe at her finest, in her finest, or in her first. It's just conceptually, without working out the minutia of the grammar of the affixes, conceptually what works better here. So the next good one is Jeremiah 2:3. Speaking of basically everything Yahweh gave to Israel's fathers out in the wilderness. It says, Israel was holiness unto me. Nah, not quite. Of the first fruits of his increase, which again, they changed the grammar and syntax, and it doesn't even really make sense. So go figure, if in the last verse he's saying like the love of thine espousals when you went after me in the wilderness in the land that was not sown, and then he picks it up in 2:3 with Kedesh, Israel, le Yahweh, Rashit, Tabuate, Kol Akaliu. Okay, so what is it actually saying? Without, again, getting into the minutia, Kudush, holy or set apart Israel to Yahweh. Okay, he set them apart for himself. Then it just goes directly on to Rashit Tabuate Kol Akaliu. It is saying what? The first of the increase, all Akaliu, consumed. All consumed. Did they consume the first of his increase or the best? Did he give them the first, or is he telling them, I gave you the best? I set you apart and I gave you the best. The finest. So the next one is super interesting. Now on its face it doesn't seem interesting, but if we always look at the context, then it gets really interesting. Because it says it's using the exact same form that we saw in Genesis 1:1. Bereshit Mamelekut Yehoiakim, that's a king, Ben Yeshiau, Josiah. So in the English it's saying, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, came this word from Yahweh saying. So a lot of prophets would begin either their book or a certain chapter. Like they would begin chapters oftentimes with the prophet saying, here's what time it is. And the more close attention we pay to the books of the prophets, the more we realize that those books are indeed being written in chronological order. And they're giving us a sense of what time it is, the date, based on typically the reign of a certain sovereign or monarch, okay? So, written exactly like we see it in Genesis 1:1, Bereshit Mamelekut, in the beginning of the reign, Jehoiakim, son of Josiah. Okay? That's Jeremiah 26:1. The problem here is when we track back a little bit to the chapter just before this, Jeremiah 25:1. When we go back to Jeremiah 25:1, what do we see? We see him dating it again. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. Jeremiah is dating chapter 25 as the 4th year of Jehoiakim. The 4th year of Jehoiakim. So if we go forward, back up to 26:1, that's written exactly like Genesis 1:1, Bereshit. Can that possibly be the beginning of his reign? Jehoiakim didn't have long reign, for one thing. Or would it be at the height, at the peak of his reign? Not in altitude, certainly not in chronology. This was at the best of the reign of Jehoiakim. This is when things were actually going good for Jehoiakim and Judah, because for a while things were pretty sketchy there for a while, and the kings that were left as vassal kings first by Mitzrayim and then by Babel, they could have had it pretty much good, but these kings, all of the darn aristocrats, which were largely started and spread by the insatiable appetites of Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam, and so on and so forth. You can imagine how many aristocrats and people in government and bureaucrats there were. And so I guess their plates had to get a little bit smaller, and they weren't okay with that. But this would have been at the best of his reign, when things were okay, before Babel would come down very terribly on Judah, make life hellish, because mostly, well, look, the aristocrats wanted the kingdom back for themselves. The people were being, just like today, really, the people were being programmed by the aristocrats to be uber nationalist. They weren't listening, they weren't paying attention to the prophets concerning the state that they were in. They wanted to hear the nice stuff. They wanted to hear the nice stuff. They wanted to hear the nationalist stuff. They wanted to hear the Constitution stuff. Sorry, I won't go into too much preaching, but this was the best of his kingdom. And we know that because it certainly wasn't the first of his kingdom. The last chapter was 4 years into his kingdom. So this couldn't be the first, and it's Bereshit. And here's the thing, the very next chapter, Jeremiah 27, what does he begin it with? Bereshit Mamelekat Iyuakim. Again, what are we talking about? In the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim? No. This is same king. It's not the beginning of his reign. It was at the height, when things were actually good. And Jeremiah's prophesying to the people of Judah and the nations all around that things are about to become very dark. Things are going to get very bad. This was not at the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. This was at the height of his reign. But Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 1, when it says, "And it came to pass in the same year, the beginning of the reign," it's Bereshit, Mamelekut, same thing, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 4th year, in the 5th month. So, how do you justify that? It literally says, Bashanat, the year, Raboit, the 4th, in Hadash month, Hamishi, the 5th. How is that in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah? You know how long Zedekiah reigned? All things told, Zedekiah reigned 11 years. This is saying, as plain as day, in the 4th year, the 5th month. So besides the fact that we have an immediate contradiction, 4th year, 5th month, that's about the middle of his reign of 11 years. Pretty close. Pretty close. And what happened was Nebuchadnezzar's captain came against him and utterly destroyed him, and that was that for Judah in the 11th year. And this was after the troubles that Jehoiakim had. That was the last king we looked at. Jehoiakim was actually doing really good under Pharaoh, and he would have just continued to do good under the king of Babel, but he rebelled. And so we saw him at what? Bereshit, the height, the finest part of his kingdom. And here in the 4th year, 5th month of the reign of Zedekiah, it is not the beginning. At best, it's the middle. I would say the fullness, the best part. That fits context. That fits the concept that we're looking at. And we could go right to the next chapter. It's like a chapter and a half, almost 2 chapters later, Jeremiah 49:34. the word of Yahweh that came to Jeremiah the prophet again, or against Elam. In what? It says Bereshit, same as Genesis 1:1. In the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah? In the beginning. Really. Because chapter and a half, almost 2 chapters before, we know we're in the 4th year, 5th month, and this is a time later. And what, we're still in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah? About this, 1 verse later, thus saith Yahweh Tzubaoth, they say hosts, armies, hordes. Sorry, Yahweh, I don't say Yahweh of hosts, I'll say Yahweh Tzubaoth. So thus saith Yahweh Tzubaoth, behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. It's Rashit, the chief, and it's actually Gabertam, so usually Geber is like strong men, good, fit, healthy men. Typically Geber is translated that, but you could say their strength. So this is why they translate it as chief. They can't translate it as the first fruits. It's the chief. It's the finest of their strength. He's like, I'm going to break the finest of their strength. I'm going to break the best of their might. Not the first, the best, the finest, the chief. And how about Daniel 11:41? He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. How about Rashit Bani Omun? It sure isn't the first of the children of Ammon, not at this late date. It sure isn't the first. It's the finest. It's the best. It's the chief. So we skipped a couple of verses in Ezekiel, and we've skipped a few verses here and there just because they're usually repetitious verses, or some of them are so full of like dubious terminology and grammars that we would spend a bunch of time like just sieving through those. Feel free to do this on your own. I would greatly encourage that. But I'm telling you why we're not looking at every single, but we're going to look at a lot because we want to be sure. We don't want to be like, meh. We want to be sure. So Ezekiel 48:14, just in the English, it says, and they shall not sell of it, neither exchange nor alienate the first fruits of the land, for it is holy unto Yahweh. Okay. But the thing is, in the source text, it's saying, and not yemekaru, so maybe sell, mamenu ula, yimer, and they're saying exchange, ulat I ober, not alienate, ulat I ober. Ober's always cross, Passover, ober, over, and not iober, crossover, rashit, et aretz. They had to change this because it's obviously and not cross over the finest of the land, ki, because kadush, it's separate or holy to Yahweh. It's not the first fruits. They will not cross over the finest of the land, for it is holy to Yahweh. About this thing, whatever it is, being described in Job chapter 40, and it says in 40:19, he is the chief of the ways of God, not the first fruits. If whatever is being described is so great, and I think, yeah, this is the chapter on Be'emut, which of course they transliterate as behemoth, and I won't rabbit trail, but that word appears all over the place, and it's obviously not a big dinosaur or anything. But either way, we're talking about a great thing or a great herd of things, which looks far more likely, or a great group of things. Iowa, the same. Rashit, not the first, the finest, the best, the heights of, the fullness of, Daraki, my ways. And then finally, one last one, which is repetitive, but just to kind of nail this home. It's in Psalms, talking about the Exodus, which was one of the greatest events to ever happen, which has been overshadowed by later questionable developments in the Bible. In the Bible, not the Old Testament, the Bible. Psalm 78:51. Uik kol bakur b'mitzrim rashit aunim bu ayeli ham. So how's it translated? And smote all the firstborn in Mitzrim, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. That's right, Bakur. So we saw all of those passages in the law that was trying to tell us to bring like Bakur, the first of Rashit, first fruits, or sometimes it would say Rashit first, Bakur, first fruits. But here, it's very obvious because Bakur is the firstborn, B'mitzrim, in by Mitzrim, Rashit Aunim. So what? The first of the strengths, the finest of their strength. It's so obvious. It's so obvious. We're not looking at first. We're not looking at chronologically. We're looking at best. We're looking at finest. We're looking at chiefest. So to wrap this episode 1 up, and I know we did one word, but man oh man, are you going to see how important this word is conceptually, the way that we look at the creation, the Bible, the history of the Bible. It's remarkably important. This isn't a small thing. Like, John didn't spend all this time on something that's like, well, it's a detail, but maybe it's not that. How is it that important? Yes, it's that important. It's that important. Because if we just apply everything we saw and how we built up that massive amount of evidence, that Rashit definitely is talking far more about not something chronological. Absolutely not. We're talking more about something qualitative. It's definitely qualitative. I mean, even quantitative if you want, but definitely not chronological. This is massively important. Bereshit. So we can stay with the in part on the be prefix, but Rashit, gonna have to apply the finest, best, the chiefest thing, the finest thing in, let's say, if I can think of a really good word to fit into this context and grammar, so I would say, at least as a placeholder for now, what we're looking at with this term, Bereshit, be, by, and it can mean in certain ways. The YT, in a sense, like we saw in complete and replete and other ETE words I'm not thinking of. Something sure, definite, inarguable. It's as though you were describing, like we see with verbs, something is completely done. So if you would see it in a noun or in a descriptive, perhaps something completely rash. What's rash? As we've seen, it absolutely works with the best, the finest, and we even saw, of course, the translators having to use chief often. So essentially what we're seeing is something in its absolute, complete, best, or finest. We're not seeing something chronological. Are we then seeing in the next word created? Well, that is the next thing we're going to look at in the next episode. And I will tell you right now, we are already seeing at least one other term that we went over today that works far better for create or made or do. And in that case, we can certainly look forward to bara probably having a different meaning as well, other than create or created. So, until that next one, I hope you got a lot out of this. I did my absolute best and will continue doing so. I will make these blanket changes to a new OSK that will be used in conjunction with this ongoing word study. This first episode of this study will be posted at the YouTube and other social media sites for free, but it's going to be added to the tier structure at my Patreon going forward, episode 2 and 3 and so on. So until episode 2, and I hope I see a lot of you at episode 2, enjoying episode 2. Because again, I love doing this and I want to provide as many people with as much as I can, but the thing is, I've got to really try to make a living doing this. Just like pastors do, just like academics in the Christian world or in the Talmudic world or in any kind of world, they all have to make a living. And if you appreciate what I do, please try to understand, I have to try to make a living doing this too. And the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, because I've looked high and low, I'm bringing everybody, I think, one of the most unique and well-backed up perspectives on biblical topics and other topics that surround the Bible, and specifically that have to do with our current condition and the state of the world, and as this applies to our individual lives and our lives and existence as a whole. So I hope you'll consider supporting my work in a number of ways going forward. Thank you for joining me.